Everyone. Welcome to Project Ground Squirrel Spotter, the launch of Rumble's iNaturalist Ground Squirrel Citizen Science Project. My name is Dr. Caitlin Wells. I am a research scientist in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at Colorado State University. And I've been a researcher at Rumble since 2009, when I started my dissertation on Golden Mantled Ground Squirrels, the charismatic little guy that you see on this slide with a picture from Joel Sartor of the Nat Geo Species Documentation Project. So I wanted to talk today about any ground squirrel or squirrel questions that you have. If you don't have any burning questions, I'm happy to just talk about my own research or all the cool ground squirrel facts that I've acquired over the years. Thanks to Anne and Aaron for inviting me to do this and for spearheading this project. This project is going to identify where different species are in the Gunnison Valley, in Colorado in general. And this is really valuable information because species move around. They expand their ranges, they contract their ranges of where they're found. And we don't know a lot about the habitats that these different species use. And with climate change, we are expecting that a lot of species might be shifting around to find their optimal habitat or environmental conditions, climate, and we want to be able to track that and know where they are. So this is the start of documenting that more formally. So thank you everyone who is involved. I will start with a few slides. I brought some pictures for sharing because I love pictures and hopefully other people do too. It's more fun than just watching me talk. And I will say that I was a little bit conflicted about whether to keep this question and answer session today, because today, Wednesday, June 10th, is an academic strike day in support of our Black colleagues in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There are historical problems of entrenched racism and white supremacy in the academy. And today is a day that many scientists, myself included, were to put aside time to do work and to do reading about that, those problems and what we can do about them. So I debated about rescheduling or trying to cancel, but instead I decided I would use this opportunity to highlight some of the awesome Black scientists involved in ground squirrel research. First of all, Dr. Greg Florent at Colorado State is a professor of mammalogy for decades now, has trained generations of mammalogists. He's there on the left. He specializes in hibernation physiology. And this picture is of him taking the temperature of a hibernating golden mantled ground squirrel, showing a student how he does that. He has maintained squirrels in hibernation in his lab at CSU in Fort Collins over the years and trained many students in research on physiology of hibernation. And found out such things as the fact that males tend to emerge from hibernation earlier underground. They'll come up to their normal body temperature weeks before other squirrels will, so that they can become reproductively active. So that was something that he discovered. And then also Dr. Brett Woods, who did his dissertation at Rumble. He was more of a field scientist then, working with yellow-bellied marmots. He's now a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and he focuses on hibernation energetics, so what the metabolic costs are or benefits are of hibernation. And he found out that despite some hypothesizing about why juvenile marmots hibernate altogether, there was this idea that maybe it was to save energy. He did the metabolic research to figure out that no, actually it's not a metabolic energy saving behavior. So there must be some other explanation. We don't know what it is yet. Still need to do some follow-up research, but this is not, even though I'm a white woman, there are lots of white men and women involved in ecology and ground squirrel research. It's not all that homogeneous. For those of you who haven't been to RMBL, and unfortunately, many of us are not able to go this summer. This is a picture of the East River Valley, where the lab is located, a beautiful valley and a fantastic place for squirrels. Here's a picture of me when I first arrived in 2009 as a graduate student, and a picture of one of the first litters that I saw emerge that summer as part of my dissertation research into what affects the reproduction of female golden mantled ground squirrels. I am a behavioral ecologist by training, which means that I'm interested in how the social environment and the physical environment affects the ecology or biology of species and behavior of species. So I was interested in how the presence of kin, female relatives, changed when female ground squirrels developed and started reproducing, how many mates they had, and even whether they produced male or female offspring. So I found that when females were surrounded by a lot of their relatives and there weren't a lot of home ranges available for new squirrels to stay and occupy, they produced mostly boy offspring, males, which dispersed to other habitats. When there was lots of room around and they weren't surrounded by very many relatives, then they produced mostly daughters who then were able to stay and maintain home ranges and territories right where they were born. So that process of dispersal, I was surprised, was affected so much by the social environment. And those are some questions that I'm still pursuing today. In some other research, I'm a conservation geneticist, which means I use DNA and genetic information to learn more about species, particularly cryptic species that are hard to study otherwise, to learn about them and then preserve them. Conservation biology is really kind of a mission-driven science where our goal is to preserve as much biodiversity as possible. And often in order to do that, we need to do research to figure out more about the biology and ecology of species. So that's a lot of what happens at Rumble, and I am very happy to be a part of it. A little bit about the golden mantled ground squirrel, my favorite ground squirrel and the species that I study. I'm part of a project that was started by my advisor at UC Davis, Dirk Van Buren. He started following these ground squirrels more than 30 years ago. And so we have a lot of information about how the population has changed over those years. But generally what happens is in May, this picture on the left, up at RMBL, where it's close to 10,000 feet, everything is covered in snow. And squirrels have been in hibernation over the long winter. They tend to emerge from hibernation in that early spring period of around 50% snow melt, or about half the snowpack. They tunnel up through the snow, start mating, gestate pups for about a month. So pups are born underground in June. So that's happening right now. We have reproductive females, at least 12 up at the lab right now, according to one of the grad students working with me. And so we can hopefully expect 12 litters to come above ground. Hopefully the fox won't get to them. We don't see them until they come above ground for the first time in July. So they're nursed underground for about a month. They're born hairless and tiny, but they grow hair and open their eyes. And by the time we see them is kind of when they're being weaned in mid-July. And then we safely trap them as soon as they come above ground. We weigh them, we figure out if they're boys or girls, and we take hair samples for later genetic analysis and hormone analysis. And now we've also started taking fecal samples to look at their stress levels and other hormone levels around that time. And then also cheek swabs to get cheek cells for looking at telomere length. And that's associated with longevity and aging. And so that's one of the projects I'm working on now. So we take a suite of physical measurements, biological measurements and samples, and then we also mark them. We give them ear tags, metal ear tags with numbers on them to permanently identify who's who and record those in our database. And then we also give them a temporary dye mark with hair dye in some unique black dye mark combination so that we can tell who they are from a distance. So every squirrel has its own little mark, and we have a sheet with all of those marks recorded. And so we're walking around with binoculars, looking for individuals and figuring out where they are, who they're interacting with, what they're doing. And that's most of the data that we take throughout the summer. Pups grow for about a month, anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. And if they're going to disperse, if they're going to leave where they were born and strike out on their own, that's about when they do it, in August. And soon after, this photo is from August, the same location below Gothic. The vegetation has started to age. It's not as nutritious anymore, but there are a lot of seeds produced. So they're gathering a lot of seeds, putting on a lot of weight, putting on those fat reserves that are going to last them all through hibernation from September to April. So that's the general annual cycle, but it shifts a little bit from year to year, depending on how much snow there is, depending on how warm it is. And with climate change and climate disruption, this is a major factor of interest of how this annual cycle and the biology is affected by how much snow there is, when spring starts, whether that's good or bad for squirrels and other species, but you know where my allegiance lies. So the last slide I have is a couple field photos. This is me early one spring. I think it was maybe late April or early May, with a safely trapped adult female ground squirrel. There's a little shade to protect them from the glare and the sun. There's a lot of solar radiation up that high, as anybody who skis knows. You'll notice that my blue puffy jacket is covered in these black smears. That's the black dye that we use to mark the squirrels. It gets all over the place. My fingers turn black. I'd go in and buy groceries in Crested Butte and everybody would think I had some horrible disease because everything was covered in this black dye. And here are 2 pictures of some of our study subjects. You can see the metal ear tags glinting from their ears. Each of those has a small number on it. And you might be able to tell that in addition to their natural black stripes on their sides that flank those blonde stripes, there are some black smears on the pup holding onto her mom's back. That was the year I think I tried to use letters to identify pups. So she was pup F. In our dye mark sheet, and she is hanging out with her mom on a rock, being vigilant, which is most of what these squirrels do, is looking out for predators. We think even that's why they have these bright white eyeliner looking marks around their eyes, is so that predators can actually see where the squirrels are looking, as kind of a signal from the squirrel, I see you from a long ways off. Don't bother trying to catch me. You won't be able to. So let's cut the chase, and you can just go find some other squirrel that's not paying attention. So really clear where that squirrel is looking. And then down at the bottom, these are 2 pups that have very recently emerged. They're tiny, only 50 or 60 grams, so way less or about the same as a pack of cards, and are just slightly bigger than that. And they spend a lot of their time playing, practicing these aggressive kind of boxing motions that they'll use to possibly fight off other squirrels when they grow up. They're practicing with their brothers and sisters. And then they also do a lot of rough and tumble play, rolling around. It's very cute. I recommend it, watching it. So those are pretty much all the photos I have of field work, but I welcome any questions anybody has right now about how I do, why I do, why I do it, all those things.
So if people have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask them with your voice, or you can also use the chat to ask Caitlin questions. And I think, Caitlin, we have a question in the chat right now. Can you see that?
No, I can't. Will you read it to me?
Yes. So what cues do they use to go into and out of hibernation?
Oh gosh. So we don't know for sure whether they're using a lot of environmental cues about how much snow there is, or the air temperature, or the temperature in their burrow. We do know that in the fall, when they're preparing for hibernation, that they tend to gain a lot of fat mass up to a certain point. So they put on a lot of weight that's going to last them through hibernation, but then they kind of stop. They don't just keep eating and eating and eating until it snows and they decide they need to go underground. At some point, there's some internal signal that they've eaten enough. This is okay. It might be a balance between how much they need to store as fat, but the fact that if they are storing a lot of fat, that makes them slower and less able to evade predators. So there might be this trade-off between wanting to be fat to get through the winter, but not wanting to be too fat in case the red fox or hawk or weasel or any of the other predators that would like to eat you are out and about and you need to hide from them.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the chat. What pattern of range change do you anticipate? Do you think that will expand into lower elevation areas or higher? And how do you think anthropogenic stasis influence this?
Great question. This is one thing that we're hoping to look at with the ground squirrel spotter data. We think that like a lot of high elevation species, ground squirrels, like the golden mantled ground squirrel, like the yellow-bellied marmot, might be moving up in elevation to track the kind of normal winter and spring conditions that they're used to. So even though summers are really, really short at high elevations, the quality of food is really good. So they have a lot of growing green forbs, flowers. They love dandelions, which are not necessarily native at high elevations, but they'll eat them. A variety of seeds that are available late spring. So even though it's a very short window in which to gain a lot of weight, they have really high quality nutrition. So they might be tracking those higher elevations and that food availability that's available at higher elevations with lots of snow, therefore lots of water and snow melt when that melts and creates really good vegetation for them to eat. This is that's sort of the climate piece of it. There are other species of ground squirrels besides the golden mantled at high elevations. And one that we've been tracking is the Wyoming ground squirrel, which, as the name suggests, we mostly knew from the state of Wyoming, but has gradually over the past 100 years moved into Colorado and started expanding its range and moving up in elevation. And one thing we're not sure about is whether they're using the same habitats as the golden mantles, and so might be replacing them at lower elevations if they are able to outcompete them, or whether they're using more of the human altered habitats like heavily grazed areas or farms or areas with shorter grass habitats. And so they're using different habitats and they can actually then share the same elevation as the golden mantled ground squirrels, just using different spaces. I have noticed over the past decade more Wyoming ground squirrels using the RMBL field site. The lab has noticed a couple Wyomings coming up every summer, starting in about mid-2000s. 2010 was when I recorded the first Wyoming ground squirrel overwintering, successfully hibernating at that elevation. We weren't sure that they could, but now at least one of them did. So that's something that we're tracking, and something we're really interested in from the iNaturalist data is where are those two species existing.
And just as a reminder, Rumble has started a new citizen science project where you can help Caitlin with that question by actually signing up for an iNaturalist account and becoming a member of the Ground Squirrel Spotter Project, where then you can take pictures of various species of ground squirrels and post them online. And then that's data that Rumble scientists can continue to look at. So thank you for everybody who is joining that project. And Caitlin, I'm curious, I know you love the golden mantled ground squirrels, and there's lots of different species of ground squirrels, like you mentioned, the Wyoming ground squirrel and other members of that family, from chipmunks to marmots to prairie dogs, all members of the tribe Marmotini, ground dwelling squirrels. But can you tell us some of the really interesting adaptations of the golden mantled ground squirrel? Why are these why are these squirrels so cool?
Yes. Hank, do you want to tell everybody about ground squirrels? Maybe not.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. So some of the coolest adaptations to high elevation living and hibernation that ground squirrels have are to do with their eyes. So we have, you might know, two different kinds of photoreceptors in our eyes. Rods, which interpret mostly low light conditions, and then cones, which are responsible for color vision, and then spatial acuity. So our retinas have about 95% 95% rods and about 5% cones, but it's the reverse for ground squirrels. So ground squirrels have 95% cones in their eyes, which means they have incredible spatial acuity. So they're looking out at a wide, flat expanse mostly. You'll see them out in the field, mostly on back legs up like this, scanning the horizon for predators. And if you see them, I guarantee that they have seen you first, because they have incredible spatial acuity due to this different density of photoreceptors. They also have, as I mentioned before, mostly ranges, or the golden mantled ground squirrels have ranges at pretty high elevation, and often that's really bright up there. There's a lot of solar radiation, the atmosphere is thin. So they have kind of built-in sunglasses. Their lenses are yellow tinted instead of clear, which filters out all the UV light. They can't detect UV light through their lenses. It filters it out so that, again, they have sharper vision with less visual scatter, and they can see really well, even from a far distance. One of my other favorite ground squirrel hibernation adaptations is that when they go into hibernation, they drop their body temperature down to just below freezing. So 30 degrees, 31 degrees, maybe at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but at temperatures where where water would freeze. But instead, they have special compounds in their blood that allow it to be super cooled. So it's still fluid, even though their body temperatures are below freezing. And even more interesting is that they are able to convert their stored fat, which under other circumstances would be kind of frozen at this temperature, into energy and maintain that metabolism even at freezing temperatures. And they do this because they're eating a lot of a special fatty acid called alpha-linoleic acid. This is found in seeds. It's made by plants. It's way different from the solid fats that we use a lot, like butter or shortening, any of those saturated fats that are dense at room temperature. They use the liquid fats that they can convert to energy even at really low temperatures. So that's pretty cool. And something that I think about a lot is for those squirrels that are raiding human foods, eating whatever hikers give them, or raiding dumpsters up at the lab. How is the fat composition that they're eating affecting their ability to survive over winter? The squirrels who don't eat enough of these low temperature liquid fats are less likely to survive over winter.
And we have another question from the chat asking, would these high elevation adaptations make it harder to live at lower elevations?
We're not sure. We think so. There are golden mantles, for instance, at lower elevations, down to 5,000 feet, although they seem to prefer slightly higher. But what I've been really interested in is how they might be different at low elevations than they are at higher elevations. So when the squirrels go into hibernation, it's kind of like this sci-fi idea of cryogenic preservation. Like they're kind of on ice. They stop aging, they stop metabolizing for the most part, except for these periodic arousals where they wake up every 10 to 14 days and kind of pee and do all the, move around a little bit, do the things that they kind of need to do to stay alive. But otherwise, they're kind of on ice. And so they stop aging. So squirrels at high elevations that are only awake for a few months of the year, they may live for 6 to 8 years, but they've only really been awake for a few years consecutively or, all together. Whereas at lower elevations, they may be awake for 6 or 8 months at a time. So they have shorter lifespans, but they've been awake for more of that time. So one of the projects I'm pursuing is looking at how aging might change with climate change, whether squirrels might have accelerated aging at higher elevations as these summers get longer. They're spending more time awake and alive and metabolizing, and therefore might wind up having shorter lifespans as they do at lower elevations. So we're using telomere length as one of these proxies for aging, and part of why I'm collecting DNA samples from pups and juveniles and adults at RMBL, and hopefully along an elevational gradient, both at low elevations and high elevations, to look at how climate change might accelerate aging.
It sounds like you have a variety of questions that you've already been studying and new questions you plan to study in the future. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about how you decided to pursue a career as a scientist.
Yeah, so I thought for the longest time I was going to be a psychologist because I was interested in behavior, and that's what I knew about. It's kind of a helping profession. You help people with their behavior and make their lives better. But I was always fascinated with biology and how other species lived. I knew a lot about how humans lived, at least in the Western world, in North America. And my first job after college was on a project looking at this endangered warbler in Central Texas called the golden cheek warbler. And basically our job was to just go out and find where they were. I had a pair of binoculars for the first time, and my job was to just track down these birds by their calls and then watch them and see if they were breeding, if they were paired up, and if they had a nest, and if their nest was successful. And so for 6 months almost, I just spent time in the woods with a pair of binoculars and watched these birds. And it was exciting because they were rare, so it felt like a treasure hunt or something when I found one. And when I found one, just watching how intelligent they were and how they were seeing the world in a totally different way than I was. And I had no idea what their priorities were, or what their lives were like, what their social lives were like, and why they were making the decisions they were making. And that just felt like it opened up a whole new world of, I want to figure that out. I want to know why they live the way they do, and how that's different from how people live, and how the decisions that they're making might make them more abundant or less abundant as a species, why they're endangered, what humans are doing that affect these decisions that they're making. So basically, I just took all of my interest in behavior that I thought would be applied to people and just shifted species. And so I knew then, like, I want to be a field biologist. I want to spend my time outside with a pair of binoculars trying to learn more about species that we just don't know enough about, and that are declining, and that we want to keep around. And we just need to know more about their biology often in order to keep them around.
Well, and that relates to another question we have in the chat saying, related to our citizen science project, getting other people out there with their cameras and maybe binoculars watching ground squirrels. The question is, are there other ground squirrel species that look similar to golden mantled ground squirrels that would be hard to tell apart for a squirrel spotter?
Well, great question. The most common mistaken identity is for people to think that the golden mantled ground squirrels, the ones that are still up with pictures that I'm showing you, are chipmunks. So they do look very similar. They both have stripes on their backs, but you'll notice that the golden mantled ground squirrels don't have any stripes on their faces. Mm-hmm. And all of the chipmunk species around Colorado and even wider do have stripes on their faces. Chipmunks are also much smaller, so they're more like 3 to 4 inches long. They're much twitchier. Their tail's always moving. They're moving kind of erratically. Ground squirrels, the slightly larger ones, tend to just kind of sit and watch and look out for predators, as opposed to darting around all over the place. Marmots are even more galumphy as they're moving around. They're not fast, I would say, most of the time. And other characteristics. I don't remember if I already said this, but chipmunks have kind of pointier faces and pointier noses. The ground squirrels tend to have more blunt faces.
We have another note from the chat saying the lumpy is my new favorite word. I wonder if the marmot scientists would agree on that scientific term.
They would. I think it's used with love and affection. I'm not dissing the marmots. They are fantastic.
Well, we are wrapping up our time with Caitlin. And so if there are any other questions from the chat, now is your, or from the crowd, now is your chance to ask Caitlin a final question. And if not, Caitlin, we're grateful to your time sharing more about your research and how you got into science and helping us to learn more about ground squirrels as well. Okay, you're not getting off free here. We do have a question. Any good squirrel jokes?
Oh, geez. So it's not good. It's just the only one I know. Well, no, I do know another one, but it's too bad to even say. So my favorite, I'm partial to puns. So what do you call it when two squirrels are fighting? It's a squirrel. But yes. I forgot there was one question that somebody asked me before the video started, and that was where the word squirrel comes from. And I love words and I love where they come from. And so the word squirrel and the family name for all the squirrels, Sciuridae, comes from two Greek words, skia and uros, meaning shadow tail. So this might be because tree squirrels have a big bushy tail that looks like the same size as most tree squirrel bodies. But also in hot climates, sometimes squirrels will put their tail above their body as kind of like a shade or a parasol to keep them cooler in direct sunlight. So at Rumble, we usually see the opposite, where squirrels are plastered, arms out, splayed on rocks, trying to warm up in the sun and sunbathing because mornings are pretty cool. But I like thinking about these squirrels with their shadow tails.
Well, and that reminds me that we also forgot to ask you the answer to the trivia question. Instead of carrying backpacks to carry their food, how do ground squirrels carry food?
In their cheek pouches. So if you see a very chubby squirrel, they're packing some seeds.
Great. Well, Caitlin, thank you very much for your time with us. We appreciate learning about ground squirrels from you. And I hope that more folks will be encouraged to join Rumble's Ground Squirrel Spotter project on iNaturalist as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And anybody watching this recording, please feel free to email me. I think Anne can provide my email address. I'm always happy to talk squirrels or answer your burning questions, or maybe in future years, show you what it's like to safely trap and handle these study organisms. So thank you all.
Thank you.